computer. Okay, everyone, so we're pretty much done through chapter 5. If you haven't been in contact with me by turning something in, you have heard from me. We need to schedule meetings. For the undergraduates, you will now be working from now till the end of the semester on completing all your assignments and your final projects. But I am going to follow all of you around to make sure that we have enough meetings to get you through. I think it's just a matter of getting started. You're probably just a little nervous and not wanting to hand stuff in. So I think if we meet, you'll feel a little better about it. So that's what I'll be doing, particularly for the undergraduates next week. For the graduate students, we'll be continuing into the lecture series. So that will be at the listed times. So we should be good to go there. And then today, in spite of what the Zoom schedule says, we're going to go over a PowerPoint that has kind of like an outline of what a CBA report looks like. And then in order to demonstrate to you what this might look like, we're going to go through a PowerPoint, and maybe we'll do another one during the time when the actual presentation kind of mock-up, because the graduate students have to do a presentation. So I'll probably try and just do another one then. But I want to give everybody a chance to see what the final report looks like and some examples on how to present things, because I think that's really, really important. That's what we're really looking for. And I think I just had a student from last summer do a MEM presentation, and I think it got rave reviews actually from our NREM graduate chair for 2 reasons. Number one, the content was very good. We spent a lot of time really trying to look at some distributional issues relative to how the aquarium fishery should be managed and what are the costs and benefits associated with that. So it was a very interesting, it was very distributional oriented. It was very interesting work. She did a fantastic job. So she had great content, but at the same time, I'm going to be very honest that between she and I, we spent probably 2.5, 3 weeks just on the presentation, and the presentation itself also got rave reviews. So I want to be very clear here that presenting these things is not that easy, because you see sometimes that these Excels are not that exciting. So we need to jazz this up a little bit, and that can take a time, but I think a good presentation overall, everyone that was at that series of all those students really gave a lot of feedback that she'd done an excellent job. And I think it was that way because we really tried to develop very, very good content. And we also spent a lot of time discussing what's the best way to deliver the content without confusing everybody with too many numbers and too much Excel spreadsheet stuff. So that's what we're going to start practicing. So we're going to share the screen. And oh, I can't spell report. Okay. Here we go. Let's bring it over. And I'm going to move you guys over there when we go into PowerPoint mode. Okay. So I want you to first kind of get this idea that we've got these steps here, and your report should have the same steps, because this is very important in really logically going through what you did. And you'll notice the first option is, or the first step is to identify options. So again, what are we focused on? We're focused on a problem, and we're trying to come up with a project that can assist in reducing the severity of the problem. So we want to start identifying options. And sometimes in her case, she actually did an extensive literature review and came up with, I think, 4 different options that we examined. There are other times when you may just have one single option. You may have option combos. So the main thing is to really have enough literature or justification in what you're doing. Now for you, of course, for the projects you're doing for me, this is not a big deal. But when you're actually out there in the real world, you want to make sure that you have a credible problem statement and then those options are clearly identified so that you can understand what they're going to actually do to help alleviate the problem. Because remember, we have the with, the solution option, and the without. So if you're having more than one option, then you really must carefully delineate the differences between those options. Also, if you're doing more than one option or combo options, you need to be clear that you explain if there's any interactions between them. That's very important. Sometimes there are, sometimes there are not. Then the next step, number 2, is really what we call the qualitative step, where you list all the different costs and benefits, and you're just describing them in words. In her case, we did a long literature review for some of the options like environmental degradation associated with the aquarium fishery. Again, we were just citing things that pointed out the various aspects or costs that might be associated with it, but we didn't quantify them. However, this is very important because in the mind of your listeners, some of those costs and benefits may resonate even though you're not describing or not valuing them. Just the description may stick in their mind, and this was what you want, because you want everyone to understand it and feel in their kind of hearts and brains what they are and how they feel about that. Because different people will have different feelings relative to these costs and benefits. One person may not see a cost as very large, where another person might see it as very large. And this is really something where you're going to appeal to the mind of the listener and the reader, because at the end of the day, we're only going to be able to use the ones we're able to value. So we're going to have to ask them to think of themselves and say, well, how big do you think these costs and benefits that we didn't value may be looming in your mind? Because that will also impact what we actually finally do. So it's very important that you give very good descriptions that are grounded in literature, if you can at all do that, or in experience. Sometimes, for example, it hasn't been published about, so you might even use testimonials to document that we can't measure this cost, but it has a lasting impact on this community. So in those cases, testimonials might be good. There are other social science methods to talk about things rather than just numbers. And I think that's very important, particularly if you have something that may not come out to be really, really strongly a solution. It's kind of on the border, but if you can lay out all these other benefits that can appeal to people just on an experience level rather than on a hard number level, that is very important. So you want to start setting that up now, because you'll pull it out again at the end of the report. Then you have to start describing how you're going to value each of these costs and benefits. In the presentation, I will show you tables, and tables are usually supported by text. And we do thrash around a lot trying to value things. We've done some funny things, like, for example, bad drinking water. You might get statistics from a hospital of how many people come in with bad drinking water related illnesses, how many days they're out, calculate what that's really costing to the economy for them to be out of work, those sorts of things. There's a lot of clever ways that you can start valuing costs and benefits, and many of them may be indirect, so they may require a longer description. Then you actually do the calculations, which is what we've been doing, which is probably the step that's the most boring and something that we don't really want to spend a bunch of time on. You don't really, when you make a presentation, spend a lot of time on it. If you look at actual CBAs, those numbers will often be in the appendix. Those spreadsheets will be an appendix, because I think we all kind of agree, not that exciting to be looking at these rows after rows of numbers and where did they come from, and setups of spreadsheets. That spreadsheet kind of becomes more of a supporting document in an appendix. and all you're really summarizing is tables with net benefits. Then if you can, you would complete a sensitivity analysis. And what this entails is identifying variables that you're not too certain about. Remember, we talked about risk. Risk is an issue where you hopefully know the probability of an event happening. If you don't know the probability of an event happening, then it's uncertainty. So usually with sensitivity analysis, if something you're not sure exactly what it's going to be, we usually go with a high, most likely, and a low. So you would do 3 options: the high, the most likely, and the low. Hopefully that's data-based, but if it isn't, you can weigh in on expert opinions. I myself have used AHP-ANP, which is an analytical device for people to weigh in on allocating, what is most likely to happen here, what's the probability of this one, and you can get experts to come up with these estimates. Very powerful. And certainly doing it yourself sometimes isn't so good, so it's always good to rely on some sort of secondary data or an expert. And then you actually rerun the CBA model. This is why I want you to set it up with a legend, so we can rerun it 3 or 4 times and see what impact it has on the final answer. And if changes in that variable, the high, the most likely, and the low, have very little impact, then you can assure your audience that while this variable is important, variations in it will not impact our answer. So we don't have to worry too much about that one. However, if we have some where variation really does matter, then you want to call everyone's attention to that, because that may flip the results of the outcomes from the project if somehow your estimates are wrong. So you want to caution based on an investigation of how variation in key variables affects your answer. And 6th, here, what is distributional impacts? This is, again, the way it's moving out in the community. So you're really looking at, and for private businesses, distributional effects may not be that important, but for nonprofits and governments who are not trying to maximize profits, they are really more concerned with social welfare. So you really want to look at where's the winners and where's the losers. And this is why we have looked at this Pareto optimality stuff that we looked at in chapter 1, because this is important if you're a nonprofit or you're a government, because they're not concerned about profit maximization. They really are concerned about the welfare of the community. And then lastly, you want to make some recommendations, and couching that is very important. You want to not go too far, because again, you're going to have some stuff you didn't value. You're going to have some sensitivity analysis. You need to incorporate all this so that the audience is satisfied, that they understand what you said, and gets a feel for what's the important takeaway message. Because we want to solve a problem. And if this isn't going to solve a problem, we want to know that. So that's really the upshot of your work. So generally, you would have an executive summary, the objectives, which would have that problem statement being addressed by these solutions you're talking about, the summary of your options, your data, the evaluation, the conclusions of the recommendation. And you can use other methods to communicate. I kind of like the presentation because, again, the big problem with the CBA is all this technical number stuff, turns people off. So in person with the presentation, you can make this so much more exciting because you can use your personality to make it more come to life. And I think that's very useful. So in the, again, the executive summary, you outline the objectives, summarize the options, and detail the results. So what are the objectives of the analysis? Again, identify the problem, and you might outline the government's priority or the business's priority, the nonprofit's priorities, so that you are sure that if you're looking at policies, we're not just pulling stuff that isn't really going to work. And then really try to describe where we're going with this, what kind of outcome are we searching for? Because I'm just going to tell you what, 100% win is never possible. You know, what are you trying to make better? How better do you think you're going to be able to make it? If this were easy, we would have already found the answer. And so you really need to be careful on how far you go and exactly what you say, because we really are trying to tie it back to how it's going to address the problem and motivate the listener or reader to think that maybe we have done enough that we are actually going to give them information that's very useful. Now, when you summarize your options, you need to link each to the desired outcome. So it's never going to be 100% perfect solution. So you need to be careful how you couch that. You're not going to solve the world's problems with one project. So keep yourself confined. And most people get too wide in their thinking on what this is actually going to do. So you really need to focus in on that desired outcome. And the other thing, which always surprises people when they talk to me, well, how do you do this? Well, I just start making assumptions and start looking for numbers. And I just say, I just assumed this. And if that's on my spreadsheet in my key variable section, like a wage rate or how many days bad water will make you sick, then that can also be changed by the user when you give them the spreadsheet. As long as you're clear why you made that assumption, then if it needs to be altered, all they have to do is go into that spreadsheet, change it, and the whole thing can recalculate. So that's very important. The other thing, you have to kind of explain how these options are going to be done. That's kind of key because you can't cost them out without that, and also analyze their net benefits. The project accountability and management. This is very important. Who's doing what? If this cost is here, is that a government cost? Is that a community cost? That needs to be identified, particularly with distributional issues, because there's some winners and losers out in the community. You really need to be clear on what exactly they're winning and they're losing, how exactly you got that, how did they kind of provide the input. Often you will ask them for input like, oh, how did you react to a flood? If we want to do flood mitigation, talk with them about what the impact of the flood, what the losses were. This is really going to require some consultation, so you need to describe all that. And then you also need to be very clear with key issues with implementing the project once you get to the recommendation, because it's all in the details. Because this is just a CBA. Then you have to go out and actually do the project. So if there's something in the setup cost or the setup scheme that you have to do to really make it clear in year zero that you're set up like you need to be rather than just a number, then we need a thorough description of what that is. Exactly what kind of equipment are you getting? Exactly how's that going to work? So that needs to be discussed, because again, what we've been doing is a simple Y0 number. There's a lot of detail between that number and actually what you're doing to implement a successful project. And then you want to start summarizing. Mostly in the body of the report, you're just going to be given that NPV. You might have a little section on risk where you say, okay, we did the high, the most likely, and the low. But actually in the body of a report and in the presentation, you're never going to see an Excel spreadsheet. And again, as I've said before, the non-valued things are the qualitative impacts. Explain your sensitivity analysis. And if you're doing distributional impact, then you need to present them. They're calling it a mapping matrix, but it looks kind of like a table where you're really outlining where all these winners and losers are in the community. Kind of like we did in homework 3 and assignment 3. Well, we didn't do it, but we got a chart, right? So you can think of a table. You could also put it on a map if you wanted, but you need to really kind of show what the areas are, what they win, what they lose. So sometimes a table works a little bit better, and although it says mapping, a table is a matrix, so that would work. And then when you're summarizing, you really want to hit the key results for each option, which is usually just that NPV number. And then kind of any concerns you have, like, oh, This one has a very, very, very risky variable in there. The difference between the high and the low is very large. So there's a lot of variation. So we need to be very careful about this variable because this may cause it to really have a problem. And this is another thing you would do with your sensitivity analysis. Why did you pick those variables? Why do you think those variables might change versus other ones? How certain are you of each variable that you put into your model, your NPV model? And of course, risk is important. It is difficult because risk assumes you have a probability. So again, as I've suggested before, if you have a variable and you can get the distribution of it, it may highly likely not be normally distributed, which is second degree stochastic dominance. It's normally distributed. So if we have to estimate the distribution, we can't assume it's normal, and we may end up with a skewed distribution and actually be looking at third degree stochastic dominance, where we're looking at totally different shape distributions, and we've got to justify all that. The graduate students will learn about that. But it's very important because a skewed distribution can affect the results a huge amount. A skewed distribution is when they owe a whole bunch in the beginning and then it just flattens out and goes way out there. So your high may be very, very high, but very, very few chances that you'd be way out there. If most of it's centered here, if you say the bulk of it's here, we can't really do a standard deviation because it's not a bell curve, but you can make a discussion about that. Another thing that's very useful here on risk is to just show a chart. Over time, this is how it varied. Just put it on a graph. Here it is. And then the reader can see, oh, yeah, right, okay. This thing is prone to big highs, not real big lows, but everything is really clustered right here around the most likely or some such thing. And it will give them more confidence that you understand those variables that you're discussing, because they're trusting you to look at these things and make an assessment. Not that easy, but you can do it. And then your conclusion and recommendations. Again, we're talking about the desired outcome, that yes, it will do what we thought it would do, and we need that positive NPV. And if we have and I have done ones with all negative NPVs where I'm explaining those, why they're like that. And what I would suggest in this case. I have had that. It's kind of frustrating, but it happens. And then, you have to have a rationale for, okay, here they all are. Because remember, we said, if they're all positive NPVs, which one are you going to pick? You got to say something. Can't do this whole thing and not make any suggestion at all. So we got to say something. So that's kind of what it looks like. And I think there's a sample in the back of the book in chapter 14, a sample final report, and you have several reports in your resources folder, CBA case studies, and then I do have journal articles. I don't know the undergraduates want to read those, but there's an entire journal dedicated to the Society of Benefit Cost Analysis that will have massive amounts of these things done in many different ways. So you can really learn a lot on how to value things indirectly. It's very interesting, actually. So preparing recommendations. Yes. So again, the highest NPV, reasons for ignoring quantitative findings, which sometimes you do. Major threats, major assumptions you have to hold, and we'll talk about this when I make the presentation. And then your distributional impacts are very important. And then kind of summarize them, how they get started, because sometimes it's hard when you're trying to look at a project. The other thing, this is funny, it's got an old. The other thing is when you do your spreadsheets, I really recommend you try to get these variable sections where you have this little table of all the variables that you could change, and then the NPV is really located somewhere else. And then you link your formulas to cells. This works a lot better, and I think it's very useful. And the reason why it is very useful, if you're giving it to a client, you can give them that spreadsheet, and if they have a good report, they can understand exactly how you got each of those numbers that you entered in there, what assumptions you made, and they can go and change it and recalculate, and then you've actually given something of value to that client. and it really makes you much more valuable to them. But it has to be organized so they can figure out what's going on. So you have to have that like legend where you outline all these data used in the analysis, and then the actual calculations of the NPVs and all this business is not that interesting to the client. They just want that final answer. So you can locate that final answer in such a way that they can easily find it. So again, remember our little analyses that we had. So we have the variable section, and some of you may not want to do this. If you're working for a private client, you may not want to look at the efficiency analysis or the referent group analysis. But if you're working for the government or a nonprofit, those might be very, very important because you want to benefit certain groups in the community, or you want to benefit the community. The other thing, which of course interests us economists, are we being efficient? I think waste is something we want to deal with, and particularly if we've done something creative like estimated some of the pollution costs associated with the project. If we've done that, I think that's very important to show that and say, okay, even though that wouldn't be charged to the client, here it is. And if you're going to negotiate with this project or this business person to do this project, and we estimate that there's going to be a substantial amount of pollution valued at this, then by telling that to the government or the nonprofit, then they can actually use that in their negotiations in order to deal with a private business that may want to do that project in their community. That's very helpful. And it also helps you to deal with the community that doesn't really understand these things. For example, they may feel very strongly about a certain issue, but if you talk to them, it's priceless. This American Express commercial, well, it's just that experience was priceless. Well, that may be true, but with the CBA, we really are trying to put some parameters around things. And I think the more you're able to parameterize around the other things you can measure and let them know, well, if the experience is worth at least this much, then this NPV is negative. And so we shouldn't do this project because you've said this experience is important, we didn't value it, but you can kind of back into its value. And that should be showing up in the referent group analysis to explain that to the public. Currently, we're using a lot of environmental impact statements to decide whether or not we should do some of these projects that affect the environment, but they don't quantify anything. They don't try to parameterize it at all. So they'll say, oh, it could do this, it could do that, could do this, and then they'll just conclude with whatever they want. But this forces us to actually address those things because we've described them and now we've got values and we're really trying to back into how big that environmental damage would have to be before this NPV just totally becomes negative. So we can do that once you assemble these numbers and get it organized. Okay, so again, it's kind of a repeat there. Where's my, yeah, let's go on. We know why we did that. I think I've covered that before. Okay, so here I want to get to this case study because this is really the interesting thing. So I'm not sure if you really realize the situation out there in the Pacific. It's very bad sometimes because of this need for something called aggregates. And in the capital of Kiriibati is on a small atoll of Tarawa, which has grown very rapidly. And because of construction, they have a booming demand for aggregates. So this is sand and gravel and rocks that you use in construction. And unfortunately, most of those in the past have come from the beaches. And as you remove those from the beaches, then you're in danger of having problems from sea level rise because climate change has definitely caused us great concern about removing too much from the coastline. It's going to contribute to coastal erosion and inundation. And the other option, which is importing aggregates, you can imagine these little places out in the Pacific, how expensive. What are you hauling? Oh, I'm hauling rocks, miles and miles. Yeah, not particularly cost effective, I don't think. And at the same time, you're risking bringing in invasives. And this, of course, if we know that we are living in Hawaii, the invasive capital of the world, why is it so bad? Because we just bring in all this stuff and it gets there and it just grows like crazy. So we're bringing in all these rocks and sand. You could bring in a lot of critters and plants, and it's very bad. So this is difficult on top of the fact it's not particularly cost effective. And another thing, which I just discovered when I started teaching this, bringing in a lot of these climate change projects from the Pacific, we're still even having problems on the beaches from foxholes done in World War II, because they basically scooped out that sand and rock. And that is also leading to inundation problems because we never put it back. So there's just these big holes sitting out there on the beaches, because when we had World War II, we built foxholes and that's causing problems. Not that we've removed it, but someone else removed it earlier, and then there's this big hole and then water starts coming in. So kind of bad. So you can see this is a serious problem. We've outlined the situation. There's a big demand for construction inputs, sand, gravel, and rocks. And it's really difficult to get them, because if we take them from our beaches, we're going to have a problem. If we import them, we could have other problems, and it's costly. So that's what we're doing. Oh, sorry. So the aim here of the project is to secure a sustainable and affordable source of aggregates for development in this place. And this is an actual case study, and we're going to actually go through and we'll actually see what they did based on the recommendations that this consultant said. So we have kind of two components here. One is that we need some way to get aggregates. So there's an idea that there's this lagoon out there that has a bunch of sand and rocks at the bottom of it, and we can scoop it up from the bottom of the lagoon and harvest it from there. And therefore, we are not causing coastal erosion because the lagoon is already there. And it would also deepen the lagoon. So if we had larger ships that want to come in, this wouldn't be horrible. Unfortunately, you notice in an environmentally safe way that possibly there's some issues here with that. So we want to make sure that whatever dredging we're doing is not ruining the environment in that lagoon. So that is one project component. And then the next problem is when this beach mining goes on, when people go harvest sand and rocks, these are little households that just go harvest this and sell it on the side of the road. So how are you going to prevent the people that live on this island, particularly the ones near the beach, from going out there and raising money from scooping up this stuff and selling it? This is an income booster for them. They may be in a socioeconomic group where they really need this money. And as we have talked about so many times, just telling people not to do that just doesn't really work that well. So that's the two parts we have to do. We can get the lagoon to do it, but that means you're going to have to deal with that sole source monopoly vendor, which is a problem in a community because it gives that sole source vendor a lot of power. And these people that traditionally for years have harvested this rock and sand will not have a source of income. And this is not going to make them very happy. So those are the two parts of this project. And if we don't have both of them, you can have all the dredging in the world, but if people are continuing to do what they've done for years and years, you're going to continue to have this problem. So those are the two components. So what the objective of the BCA is to assess the economic feasibility of dredging so that we have a source of this aggregate rather than using coastal mining to obtain it, and to assess the implications of the proposed ban on coastal mining, which means, so are they going to stop doing it, and what are we going to do to make them do it? You have to stop. How are we going to do this? So it's kind of, it's an interesting project. So here we go with our first table, and this is very, very useful because you notice it hits all of our points. It describes our current situation, and it does it with a bullet outline. So for a PowerPoint presentation, this is actually very, I should get that over. Oh, there we go. No, it's trying to not cover up words. Okay. All right. Okay, there we go. Sorry. So you notice it describes in bullet points. This is very useful to show your audience and also to put in your reports because it distills the situation down to the current situation. So this is the without option. And then we have two with options. The current situation, that are the without option and the with options. So this kind of explains the problem setting. This kind of explains the without option, and this explains the with option. You may have more than one with option. So your table might be a little bit wider than this one, but you notice how attractive it looks with those bullet points. And it covered exactly what I said with a few numbers. So you don't have it inundated with numbers, but you have some. So it kind of quantifies how much we're mining. It also quantifies how much we're importing, which immediately tells us why we're concerned about the situation, because we're mining a lot more than we're importing. That must tell us that it's very expensive to import and we don't really want to do it because otherwise this balance wouldn't be like this. And it also is pointing out the problem. So we have coastal erosion, and that's going to really bring on risks due to infrastructure. So there was a road usually around islands right on the coast. So that may disappear, very expensive. It may get to your fields, which are on the other side of that road, and get salt water in your agriculture. If you can't feed yourself, major problem. And then there's some public health problems as the salt water gets into your fresh water and you have no decent drinking water. And you notice how nicely it kind of hits the various high points of what you're worried about. It also, you notice, points out the problem I was discussing, that coastal mining is a source of primary or secondary income. So that's a major issue when you're dealing with things that are going to take away people's income. This is very difficult because income is very, very important in the immediate term. If you can't feed your family this week, I don't really care how you value anything else. If you can't feed your family, if you can't house your family, it's going to be very difficult to get any kind of change away from this situation. And then lastly, it points out that people are just, they know it's a problem, but they just are not listening because they need the money. So telling them what to do, we already did that. We have beach mining regulations. They're not listening. We need plan B here. It isn't working. So then we kind of highlight the information that we have about the without situation. So it says it's going to keep increasing for the next 10 years. And aggregates are going to increase 7% a year, which is nice because it's more than beach mining, but beach mining starts from a much higher base. So the volume from beach mining is going to go up a lot more. It assumes that coastal erosion will continue if we do nothing. And it kind of lists the cost of seawalls because they're going to become more and more expensive as the erosion gets more and more. And here we're just assuming that the same families are going to continue and the lack of compliance will continue because we have regulations, they're not listening. So if we do dredging and beach mining ban, not just regulating, but banning, here's kind of our initial number that we came up with of how much we're going to dredge. And we point out how much we think beach mining is going to continue. And you notice that's significantly smaller number than we have over here. So we've really outlined now some of the data we need, and people can kind of see it in an organized fashion. This is very helpful. And you notice there's not much numbers, but we have key numbers there. Then we say our assumption that seawalls will not have to be made bigger, so that won't be more expensive. We won't damage our infrastructure or public health, although we are admitting right up front, you notice, that we might impact our fisheries due to the dredging. So we're very upfront about that. Then our next cost is this family income that we will lose for some stakeholders. And we also point out these other two issues that we have some beach mining, and you notice up here we're going to keep mining large boulders, and then we're going to have a little bit that still continues. So we've acknowledged it. We've admitted that this is not going to stop it. And I think that's very important, that you be very realistic, because this is what people don't like when they see some of this economic stuff, particularly non-market values, where we kind of do these, just ask people what it's worth. So the more facts that you can put forward on this situation overview and outlook of the options, the better off you are. Never try to act and ignore things and act like it's not happening. And then again, we've acknowledged what we see as the key problem with this thing, this dredging, is the impact on the fisheries and people's concerns. So we have acknowledged it. This is very important. So now we're going to start pulling from there the cost, so we can talk about how we're going to value those. So we're organizing them that from that table, and we've been very clear about the negative impacts on the fishery, the negative impacts on livelihoods, negative perceptions of the projects. And then you're going to have all the cost of this dredging business. You know, you need a barge, you need to go out there and you need to pull it back in, you need to sort it because it's just going to be a bunch of stuff. So how's that going to happen? And you got to move it around because now it's in one spot, and you're not going to have families doing that because it's coming off the dredge. And so we're very clear. And this now you're kind of outlining the overview of the steps you're going to have to go through to value these costs, if at all, if you value them at all. And then you have the benefits. You have an increase in the local supply of aggregate. You have reduction in the costs of maintaining and replacing infrastructure. You have reducing the costs associated with the loss of production, agricultural production, and public health costs. So again, we're very clearly making our lists. Then the next thing we do is actually talk how we're going to value them. So we go down, we start making our table, and we take this right off of those details, and we identify, is it a cost or a benefit, a cost or a benefit? And then we describe the valuation method that we're using. It's very organized. It lets people be very clear what we're doing. And in the actual report, of course, you might describe it more in detail, and then you just say it's not valued. In the one we just did for the aquarium fishery, we actually started dividing it. I came up with the idea that we should actually divide it on the different stakeholder groups. So we talk about, with this option, which stakeholder groups are going to get benefits and which stakeholder groups are going to bear costs. So we actually went right into the distributional analysis in our presentation at this point, because we didn't really collect any primary data. Most everything we used was existing published information or information we could request that was collected by a state agency or someone else, or it was readily available on the internet. Some prices, we would just go to the internet and get the price. So we actually started doing a little bit more discussion on how this benefit affected things, the stakeholder groups in the community. Here we do it as a separate table. So you can do it different ways, but this is your distributional analysis where you have your beach mining households, your fishing households, and we start to really peg the benefits in that community. So you see beach mining households are going to lose a lot. There's the big cost for the community, and here's the big cost paid for by the government, which is the cost of the barge and all the associated infrastructure to do this. And here's some opportunity costs, right? The cost of mining costs avoided. So you notice that we then net them out right here. And then when we don't know them, we say that, right? We say that right there. We're very obvious. So we're starting to put out those numbers. But you notice this is not a big, long, fancy Excel spreadsheet. This is a nice, friendly table, and it's linked with things we've already told them about. And we describe, so then we're clearly now costs on one side, benefits on the other, and we're starting to get to our net benefit picture. It's not the same as a spreadsheet, but it's pretty orderly and is covering terms they've already heard you use. And now we actually just get to the NPV. And here we actually let them see what was valued, what was not, so they can see the addition. We're all using present values. So this is like we did in chapter 1. We use those present values, we put them on the chart, and we come up with the NPV. We let them see what went into the total costs, and it was basically the cost of dredging, and what went into the benefits, and each one is described, and they can check back on the previous tables. And it's very clear what these numbers are accounting for. And you notice, again, I recommend that if you didn't value something, you continue to mention it, because as you look at this thing, it's very clear where we need to be wary of the numbers. We don't have the environmental impacts of dredging. Gee, let's think more about that. Maybe we need to measure that in the future. Because if we decide to do this, this might be a recommendation that you might want to make, because we notice a positive NPV. What does that mean? At a 10% discount rate, which I must tell you is quite high for a government. Usually governments, as we learned, are between 2 and 4%. So this has a very attractive NPV. So if it's looking really good, I think you need to cover your bases by really drawing attention to this one cost that you have not valued, because this is something you could look at into the future. You could monitor the environment as the dredging goes on, and this would help quiet down the people concerned in those costs, about those costs, and kind of waylay the negativity. It's very important that you understand that not everybody has your values. You need to be very upfront about this, and you need to take concern. And at the same time, this NPV could be even bigger because we didn't value these things. The losses to agriculture and health impacts that we avoided were not valued. So if they were, in fact, this NPV would be even bigger. So that's another thing you should be pointing out. As you go through this table, you want to really discuss here, you know, here's things we didn't value. This should be very important to the community. And this is something that we can actually take action to monitor in the future. Because it looks, as soon as you see this thing, like this project is a go, because it has a positive NPV, it has a very high discount rate. It looks like a pretty good project to me. So that's what the picture you want to start painting, because people are not really going to get too excited about this number. What they really want to focus on is this and what we haven't accounted for, and the sensitivity analysis. What happens if your dredging costs were wrong? If your dredging costs were wrong, if it really was 10% more expensive, and let me just remind you, this is a government project. Has a government project ever come in at cost? So this is why this was done here by this consultant. Government projects are always above cost. So what happens if it goes up by 10%? A positive NPV becomes quite large in the negative realm. So this is a big thing in this particular BCA presentation. You really need to call attention that costs must be controlled. We cannot have the spiraling government cost situation on this project. So you need to be very upfront about that. You are not responsible if the government cannot control the cost. You've made every effort to collect the costs and be as accurate as you can be with what it will cost, and that if they do undertake the project, one of the things they must do is manage it properly to ensure those government costs do not go spiraling out of control, because it will ruin the project's NPV. It will simply make it not a good project. So you need to be clear about that, because this is serious here and your reputation's on the line. The next one you notice, let's say our aggregate imports changed, right? they were reduced by 50% and 75%. We thought this thing was really going to replace imported ones, which are very expensive. But even if they only replace half of them rather than 75% of it, the thing still has a positive NPV. And I think that's important because we don't want to have to pay a fortune to do construction. That's why we're doing this. And also at this point, I would be reminding everyone that any reduction in aggregates imported is probably a good thing because there's a big environmental risk besides the cost, which is accounted for in the NPV. We did not account for some of the environmental risks associated with bringing in that aggregate. We know they're there. We didn't account for them. So even if we only reduce them by 50%, we still have a positive NPV, and we are protecting ourselves from some of the risk of invasive species. So now we're going to talk about the distributional effects. So we have 1,200 households that do beach mining, and an average loss has been measured. This is how much they're going to be giving up. So we're being very straight up on who the losers are in a monetary sense. So what we're kind of suggesting is to kind of redistribute some of the benefits from the business. Like, for example, either helping these mining households find other income sources, or kind of incorporating them as retailers for aggregate, giving it to them at a reduced price so they still have some way to make income from aggregate sales. So maybe we don't have the government selling it, we just have the government harvesting it, and we create a cadre of sellers and that they're able to make income from that. It is hard to find alternative income sources in some economies, so that may be difficult, but I think this idea of reselling is a really good one. And that way you don't have to have government workers, but they actually are kind of mini entrepreneurs. And I think that's a very good model. I think it reduces government costs by not having to supervise the sales of it. And I think it kind of reduces the ill will associated with this project, because losing 1.5 million of income in these households is going to be very painful. As I said, economics sometimes doesn't think about that with efficiency analysis, but the reality is in community, when poor households lose something, it matters. And I think that here's a way that you can try and make up for that, and then just simply not produce a government job, but actually support their households in activities that they are now used to doing. They are now used to selling aggregate. Let's support that. And let's give them the aggregate to sell by subsidizing it. So here's our recommendation. Our NPV is positive, even though we didn't include any avoided health impacts. However, if dredging costs get out of control, then this project will have a negative NPV. We also did not evaluate the environmental impacts of dredging. So fishermen may be impacted, community that recreational activity that happens in the lagoon might be impacted. And then our biggest problem with the distributional effects of this project is the beach mining households will lose income, and it may be difficult to get them to comply with the beach mining ban. So what happened as a result of this report? They now have a dredging barge. And I guess it came in at budget because it's operating successfully. And I think that it's a good example on how we could present something. So there we are. We're about done. Does anyone have questions? Oh, we have a chat. Oh my gosh. So at any point now, we're pretty much done. So if anyone has questions, that's kind of what it looks like. And I think you can kind of see now how to kind of organize some of this data in your reports. I think these tables are very effective. You can see these are ones that I actually made myself. I went through this report. I made these tables based on my feeling of how one should present these things. These are what my students are all given, and every student I've ever done a BCA with uses them. and we try to recreate them in a certain, as much as we can in order to make the report easier to understand and for them to actually see this linking between the with and the without, and also those opportunity costs and things that maybe you don't value, or other issues that are coming up that you want to highlight for the audience as you move through the report, so that they feel like you've done a credible job. I think you would probably agree with me that this report, you feel like, oh yeah, I totally get why they did that, and I totally get what the problems were and what the impacts were. And it wasn't that long and it wasn't that technical. You did not see any discounting in this thing, but you kind of get a feel for, oh yeah, okay, so we need to be careful here, or no, this looks pretty solid. And I think you just need to admit that not everything in these things are going to be solid, but you can point out the highlights of what you want to say. So any questions? If no, we're going to stop recording and we're going to end the session. So thanks for attending.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.